So why don't we get started? Good afternoon. I'm Jill Ravitch. I'm the Sonoma County District Attorney, and I am here to make a short statement, and then I will take questions from you. I am here to announce that I have completed my review of the investigation into the shooting death of Andy Lopez on October 22nd, 2013. I want to begin by restating that this was a tragedy, and our hearts go out to the Lopez family. I have reached out to the family since the day this incident occurred, and I've offered to meet with them and offered the services of our Victim Services Division as well. I spoke to their attorney earlier today, and he is aware of the purpose of this press conference. Because of the impact of this tragic shooting has had on our community, I've chosen to make a public statement with regard to the investigation and determination. Ordinarily, a detailed press release is prepared, but I thought it essential that I appear to answer questions. I've also taken the extra step of preparing a 52-page synopsis of my report to the grand jury that is going to be available to the public at the conclusion of this statement. Copies will be here shortly, and the report is being posted on the District Attorney website. I want to remind you, our role in reviewing this investigation was solely to determine whether there was any criminal liability on the part of any person, including the involved deputies. This responsibility is vested in me by the Constitution and by statute. It is a responsibility that attaches to every criminal investigation in this jurisdiction. And we've employed the same methods in this review of this investigation that we do in others. We've critically analyzed the evidence, reviewed and applied the pertinent laws, and made a determination as to whether a criminal act occurred. The investigation was the result of the invocation of the Sonoma County Law Enforcement Chiefs Association Law Enforcement Employee Involved Fatal Incident Protocol. This protocol represents an agreement among law enforcement agencies in this county to allow an agency other than the employing agency to undertake an independent criminal investigation of the event. In this case, the Santa Rosa Police Department took on the lead responsibility for the investigation since it involved members of the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. The Petaluma Police Department provided assistance, and the District Attorney's Office participated, as it always does, by going out to the scene, monitoring the investigation, and providing legal advice regarding the preparation of search warrants, as well as attending the autopsy. The investigation was extensive and exhaustive. The initial call for support involved a dispatch of 45 sheriff's units, with 38 units arriving. The Santa Rosa Police Department sent 14 units. In addition to contacting witnesses at the scene and collecting evidence at the site, officers conducted a wide canvass of the neighborhood. After the initial contact with witnesses, officers continued to monitor the press and social media in search of additional witnesses and information. A report was prepared by the Santa Rosa Police Department and provided to my office on January 29th, 2014. It has included over 1,000 pages of documents, including summaries of interviews and contact with approximately 200 witnesses. There were almost 200 hours of audio recordings, transcripts of interviews, forensic reports, crime scene investigation reports and photographs, as well as a coroner's report. Approximately 175 items were booked into evidence. I assigned 2 experienced members of my office to review the report, and I've reviewed it as well. Both of the individuals have come from other agencies and have minimal ties with either the Santa Rosa Police Department or the Sheriff's Office. The assigned prosecutor supervises the homicide caseload and has over 23 years of experience, including handling many homicide and critical incident cases. The assigned investigator has over 33 years experience as a sworn peace officer, and while employed with a major metropolitan police department, conducted numerous criminal investigations involving police officers, including several officer-involved shootings. In addition to the review by this team, I personally reviewed all of the reports as I indicated. We met repeatedly to discuss the status of the review and what, if any, additional investigation was needed. My chief investigator and assistant district attorney also participated in the review. We undertook additional steps once the reports had been reviewed. Witnesses who had been interviewed were recontacted for clarification. The pathologist retained by the Lopez family was interviewed. The scene was visited on multiple occasions, and additional measurements were taken to assist in the review. We also retained experts to assist in the evaluation of the case and requested further forensic testing on evidence. Additionally, we obtained and reviewed documentation from a variety of sources, including employment, education records, and military records. As I've said, the events of October 22nd, 2013 are absolutely tragic. A 13-year-old boy was killed by an experienced law enforcement officer. The loss of this young life under these circumstances is a loss for all of us, and this community will be forever changed for what happened that afternoon. Questions will remain with regard to the facts that have been determined through this investigation, and questions will continue with regard to what the community can do to avoid another tragedy like this. Yet, as I stated earlier, the responsibility of this investigation and report is solely to determine whether criminal charges are warranted based on the available evidence. The evidence establishes that while in the lawful performance of his duties, Deputy Gelhaus was faced with a highly unpredictable and rapidly evolving situation. Given his training and experience, he believed, honestly and reasonably, that he was faced with a do-or-die dilemma. Wait for the subject to fire what he believed to be a deadly weapon and risk that either he or his partner would be shot and killed, or fire his weapon when the threat was turned toward him. Here, the implementation of lethal force was a reasonable response under the circumstances, according to all of the evidence that we have reviewed. Therefore, the actions of Deputy Gelhaus were lawful, and no criminal charges will be filed against him at this time. Now, I have some information with regard to the basis of the decision that I'm prepared to give you, and I will go through it briefly, and then I'll answer any questions that you might have. And as I indicated, we will have the report available for you at the conclusion of this press conference. The evidence established the following: that the deputies were on patrol in uniform and in a marked patrol vehicle, Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies. That Andy Lopez was walking northbound in the vicinity of Moreland Avenue and West Robles sometime after 3:15 p.m. That witnesses saw Andy Lopez carrying what appeared to be a firearm that had the characteristics of an AK-47. And I'm going to take a minute and put this photograph up for you. For those of you who attended an earlier press conference, you saw some actual items, one which was seized at the scene and one which was an AK-47. So we have photographs of those items for you as a reminder today. So the photograph to the right shows an actual AK-47 at the top, and the photograph at the bottom, or the weapon at the bottom, is the weapon that was recovered in the vicinity of Andy Lopez after he was shot. The other photographs that we're looking at that are directly to my left here show again the weapon or the item that was recovered at the foot of Andy Lopez. And this item at the bottom was purchased by my office. It is the same item as you see at the top, with the exception of the far right, where you will see it still has the orange tip attached. This photograph shows a firearm in the condition it is when it's purchased from the store. What we also know from the evidence is that a witness drove by and told Andy Lopez to get rid of the gun because police were behind him. We know that Andy Lopez was carrying the weapon by the pistol grip to his side with the barrel pointed downward. We also know that Deputy Gelhaus saw what he believed to be an AK-47 held by a subject who he described as a man. We later learned that Andy Lopez was approximately 5'2" and weighed 133 pounds on that date. We know that Deputy Gelhaus alerted his partner, Deputy Michael Chimel, and called in code 20, which means urgent response needed. And according to one officer, it's a code that's rarely used here in Sonoma County. We know that the lights were activated on the patrol car that was a marked patrol car, and that the siren was blipped. And that Deputy Chimel pulled to the curb, and Deputy Gelhaus got out of the car and went into the V of the door with his gun drawn as the car was being parked. We also know from evidence that was established that Deputy Gelhaus called to the subject to drop the gun twice, in a voice loud enough to be heard by a witness across the field. In fact, he was at the far end of the field. And that we also know the subject did not drop the weapon, but according to evidence that we've received, turned toward the deputies from a distance of approximately 67 feet. We also learned that as the subject turned toward the deputies, the weapon in his hand turned as well, and the barrel started to rise. We've learned that as Deputy Chimel exited the driver's side and started to assume a firing position via the driver's door, he heard shots fired and saw the subject take a step back and fall to the ground. Deputy Gelhaus had fired 8 rounds at the subject, hitting him 7 times. The gunshot wounds were to his left arm, his upper arm, his chest, his right hip, his right upper buttocks, and both wrists. The wound to the upper left arm was through and through from front to back. The trajectory on the remaining wounds was right to left. The trajectory on the wounds to the lower body were at an upward angle, indicating the subject was falling or near the ground at the time the wounds were sustained. We learned from an expert that a firearm of the type that was used on this occasion can expend 8 rounds in less than 2 seconds when used by an average police officer. The suspected firearm went to a position by the individual's foot as he fell to the ground, or was found there after he'd fallen to the ground. And we know that Deputy Gelhaus immediately called in that shots were fired, and police and fire arrived shortly thereafter. A passerby recorded the actions of the deputies after the shooting. They remained behind their car doors, according to this recording, and were heard to call to the subject not to touch the weapon as they waited for backup. We have a photograph of that in the materials that will be provided later today. When the backup support arrived, the deputies cautiously approached the subject, and Deputy Gelhaus moved the weapon away from the subject's foot. When it was determined that the subject was in medical distress, resuscitation efforts began, and it was determined that the subject had expired at the scene. That person was later identified as Andy Lopez. The weapon that was at his foot was later determined to be a replica AK-47 firearm, as you see depicted in these photographs, with the orange tip missing. It was in the condition that it appears in these photographs today. The investigation began after the shooting, and it established a few salient facts. Number 1, Deputy Gelhaus is familiar with AK-47 firearms. He's fired them, and he's confiscated them in his line of work and in his capacity in the military. He's familiar with the capacity of these weapons to penetrate body armor and vehicles. He was a firearms instructor in the military and at the sheriff's office. We also know, as I said, that according to a retained expert, 8 rounds from a firearm of the type used by Deputy Gelhaus can be expended in less than 2 seconds. And we know that Deputy Gelhaus had a total of 18 rounds in his weapon at the time that he fired. We've learned that when Deputy Gelhaus fired, he believed that the weapon that Andy Lopez had in his possession turned toward him was an AK-47. Deputy Chimel believed so as well. Furthermore, others who came to the scene or saw Andy Lopez walking along the street had a similar opinion that it was a real weapon. Those include civilian and law enforcement witnesses. Now, the law provides a complete defense to one who acts to defend himself or others. And I'll briefly recite it to you so that you can have an understanding of it. The law provides that a person acts in lawful self-defense or for the defense of others if all of the following exist. The person reasonably believed that person or someone else was in imminent danger of being killed or suffering great bodily injury. The person reasonably believed that the immediate use of deadly force was necessary to defend against the danger, and the person used no more force than was reasonably necessary to defend against that danger. A person's right to self-defense is the same whether the danger is real or merely apparent. This investigation has uncovered evidence that supports such a finding. There's a quote that is often cited in cases such as this, and I think it bears repeating today. The determination of the reasonableness of an officer's use of force must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation, and that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision of hindsight. So with that, I reiterate that we completed an exhaustive investigation. The Santa Rosa Police Department presented us with an extensive investigative report that we reviewed and that we added to through our own investigative efforts. And as a result, we have produced for you a 52-page report that outlines the facts that we found to be true, with the application of the law to those facts, and the determination, in fact, that this was lawful self-defense on the part of Deputy Gelhaus. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer those at this time, and I want to make clear that I will be available to answer questions in the days going forward. Yes.
The report you give to the grand jury, does that come with recommendations to them, or do you just give it to them, this is what we did a year ago?
The process that we employ here in Sonoma County, we have a sitting grand jury. It is a civil grand jury, and it is their job to review critical incident reports and take whatever action they deem appropriate. So I will provide my report to them. It is more extensive than the one that I'm providing to the public, and it will be up to them to decide what, if anything, to do with that report.
Jill, did you give any consideration to releasing the entirety of the report with names redacted to protect the identity instead of just a summary?
Yeah, I did, but there's a lot of confidential information in there, and I thought that it would be inappropriate for me to put it into the public venue. The crux of the investigation and the findings are contained in the report that's been made available to the public. It's important to note that historically we don't provide any reports to the public. Historically we simply provide a press release, but in this circumstance I thought it was essential that I provide as much information as I could while respecting the privacy rights and confidentiality interests of the parties that were involved.
And do you know how much time elapsed between the time that Andy was spotted by the deputies and the shots were fired? Did you ever have a timeline to cap that degree of specificity?
We do. You will find in the report that I have provided, we included the CAD dispatch log, and what we know from information that we received from witnesses on the scene, that the first call came in from Deputy Gelhaus of Code 20, which was at the same time that he said to his partner that he had seen something at approximately 15:13:58. It's indicated in the CAD that it came in later because there is a lag between when the call is received and when it's actually inputted into the system. So it would be received at 15:13:58. And the call that shots were fired was approximately 15:14:17, or 19 seconds later. That was the actual time. The recorded time was 15:14:25. You already asked me a question. Yes.
You indicated that there were other witnesses, including law enforcement, who saw the replica weapon and believed it to be a real weapon. Can you elaborate on that?
I can.
What the circumstances were?
And the report elaborates on it as well. You will find that there are a number of witnesses whose statements are summarized in the report. There was an individual, as I indicated earlier, who was at the far end of the field. There was an individual who was driving by in a truck. There was another individual who was in a van who was driving by. And then there was the individual who recorded some of the events on his cell phone and provided it to law enforcement after the fact. There was also a vehicle with a variety of people in it that saw some of the incident, and the occupants in that vehicle have given statements as well. Additionally, there were some people in surrounding homes who may have looked out and their statements were provided. Furthermore, we spoke with individuals who were familiar with this particular item and talked with members of law enforcement about the appearance of the item and discussions that they had had with Andy Lopez about its appearance.
And again, it's the far picture that has the real one and the one he was holding.
This is the item that was found at Andy Lopez's feet. This is an item that was purchased at a store that has the end on it unaltered. It's as you purchase it. On the far left, the item at the top is an actual AK-47 that was shown to you at a press conference in October. And the item at the bottom, again, is the item that was found at the feet of Andy Lopez.
Is there any other investigation going on aside from yours about the same incident?
Well, I'm not aware of any other investigation. I can tell you that I have been in touch with both the Attorney General's office and with the representatives of the Department of Justice. And an investigative report has been provided to the Department of Justice for purposes of looking into a civil rights investigation.
And whose request would this, or would it be something they would do on their own, or based on a request?
The
from
protocol calls for us to provide those investigative reports to the FBI, and we follow protocol in this situation. I've been in touch with representatives from the Department of Justice to ask them if they would like to undertake an independent investigation, and I've told them, both members of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, that I will cooperate with them and provide them with a copy of the report that you're going to receive today.
Have they indicated one way or the other, if they're interested,
If they're interested in what?
conducting an investigation?
We had the conversation, I'm going to provide them with a report. Yes, ma'am.
District Attorney, how did you establish that Officer Gelhaus told Andy Lopez to drop the weapon 2 times?
Well, interestingly enough, it was established not only through discussions that were had with the deputies, they were sequestered immediately after the incident in that they were separated and each of them was kept in the custody, if you will, of another deputy, taken to a location where they were ultimately interviewed. I think it was that night. It was nighttime by the time they were interviewed. In addition to statements by each of those deputies, there were individuals at the scene who reported hearing the deputy twice tell Andy Lopez to drop the weapon.
Do you recall how many people said that?
I recall one for certain, but I'm going to have to refer you to the report for the exact number of individuals who heard it. Different people heard different things, as is usual in a situation where you're covering a large area. Some people recalled hearing voices before they heard shots fired, some did not. Some people recalled hearing a siren blip, some did not. Some people recalled one deputy coming out of the vehicle, some recalled 2. So there were a variety of inconsistencies, but at least one civilian, the fellow at the far end of the field, I am certain, heard the deputy call twice to drop the weapon before shots were fired.
Would you mind talking about the 8 shots and how that might be considered a reasonable response? And did the deputies' past officer-involved shootings play any part of your investigation?
Well, when we looked at the number of shots that were fired, we did a thorough analysis, first with regard to the proximity of the 2 parties, the suspect and Deputy Gelhaus, the movements on the part of the suspect toward Deputy Gelhaus that were reported to us, which included turning toward the deputy and disregarding an order to drop the weapon. With regard to the number of shots fired, we looked at where the wounds were sustained, and we engaged an expert to work with us to track the trajectory of those rounds that were fired. So not only did we track the trajectory inside the subject, but we tracked it through the field, and we were able, as you'll see in the report, to make some conclusions with regard to where the subject was located at the time the rounds were fired, and whether or not he was facing toward the deputy or not. The location on the body also was important to us in making this analysis with regard to his whether he was facing the deputy and whether or not he was upright or whether or not he was on the ground. And then finally we engaged the services of this other expert, Dr. Lewinsky, who talked to us about the speed with which somebody can expel that many rounds. And as I said, it's within 2 seconds. On top of that, in our discussions not my discussions, in connection with the investigator's discussions with the deputy, they talked to him about when he began to shoot and when he stopped shooting, and we established that when there no longer was a threat, the shooting stopped. It's worth pointing out that the deputy had 18 rounds in his weapon and only 8 were expended. Yes, sir.
Madam DA, did you ever establish that Andy Lopez actually heard the command to drop the weapon?
No, sir. He was not available to give me that.
No, but I mean, did he look like, I mean, there's traffic going at the same time, there's environmental factors. You hear somebody say, drop the weapon, he's looking around like this. Who's talking to me?
Sir, we can engage in conjecture and speculation about this entire tragic situation. What I had to do in my analysis was look at the facts that were established through the evidence and make a determination about whether or not the shooting was lawful. And I looked at a variety of factors, including those which I just indicated, as well as factors such as turning toward the officer, as well as factors such as being told that police were behind him and that he should drop the firearm before the encounter occurred, as well as other factors that were established through the course of the investigation. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk about what your investigation found as far as why Deputy Chimel did not fire any shots?
Well, what we learned through the course of the investigation, first of all, we're dealing with a situation that is instantaneous. And what we learned was, through statements that were given by various witnesses, including the deputies, Deputy Chimel was literally putting his foot on the brake, putting the car into gear, into park, when Deputy Gelhaus had released his belt and he was sliding out and taking a position between the door and the frame of the vehicle. So that by the time Deputy Chimel had come out from behind the steering wheel and was beginning to take a similar position, Deputy Gelhaus had already expended rounds. That's what we determined.
I'm wondering, you mentioned that the officers didn't approach Lopez until backup had arrived. At what point did they call?
Until, I'm sorry, till what?
Until backup had arrived. At what point did they call for emergency help, ambulance or fire? Was that along with backup? And how long until they got there?
The CAD dispatch is connected to the report that we put out, and as I said, the time that shots fired was broadcast the actual time was 15:14:17, and the CAD reports it at 15:14:25. But it was in essence 19 seconds after the initial call for emergency assistance.
And how long until they arrived?
This shows that I believe this shows that the first deputy on the scene was recorded at 15:19:21.
And was he already, did he die immediately or was he alive?
Well, I can't tell you if he died immediately. I can simply tell you that at the point that the deputies approached him and secured him, he was in medical distress and that he was pronounced at the scene. And that he'd received 2 wounds that were the cause of death, 2 separate wounds. Can I ask somebody, have you asked a question?
I haven't been. Has any law enforcement officer ever been charged by the DA's office in a shooting case?
Sir, I've been district attorney since January 3rd, 2011, so I can only speak to that period of time. If you want to talk globally with regard to the state of California or the United States, I think it's a bigger conversation than I'm prepared to have right now.
Insofar as you've been DA, insofar as you know in Sonoma County, has there ever?
Since I've been district attorney, no police officer has been charged in connection with an officer-involved fatality. Members of law enforcement have been charged with criminal misconduct in other areas by my office. And I am aware that members of law enforcement have been charged in connection with officer-involved fatalities in other jurisdictions. We had, to put it into context, since I took office in 2011, we had 1 officer-involved fatality in 2011. We had none, fortunately, in the year of 2012, and we have had 4 in the year of 2013. And thus far, we've had 1 in the year of 2014. And a number of those are currently still under investigation.
The attorney and investigator.
You know what? I'm going to take hands. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Was there any, as I understand it, they were simply driving down the street. There was no call, there was no complaint of a man with an AK-47 or a gun. They merely came upon it. And from the time they came upon him to the time they fired the shots, how much time elapsed?
Well, you are correct that they were just on patrol in the area. They were not responding to a specific call. And I can tell you that we have the CAD log as a point of reference, and I think I've already given you the timeline that's provided to us through the CAD log. So, yes.
One of many opinions expressed since this happened is that given the severity of this case, that it would only be reasonable that a jury be able to hear both sides and render a verdict. How would you respond to that?
I have a responsibility to bring cases under the rules of ethical conduct and as advised under the Constitution that can bear the weight of the criminal justice process. We don't file charges and simply put them in front of a jury. We file charges that at least meet a certain burden of proof, because ultimately a conviction requires burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this case, based upon all the evidence that we've received thus far, the burden is on us to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this was not a case of lawful self-defense. And I'm unable to sustain that burden based upon the evidence as it's presented to me today. Yes?
Jill, were all the shots that hit Andy Lopez, they all occurred while he was still upright, or did any hit him?
No, what we found through the analysis, because of the trajectory, it appeared that he was either bent over or he was going to the ground at the time that some of the shots hit his body.
Was the 2-second thing you were talking about, is that the amount of time that he could expend that amount of shots, or 2 seconds for the deputy to expend those amounts of shots?
The force with which an AK-47 can expend rounds is not what I was addressing. I was addressing a handgun similar to that which was possessed by Deputy Gelhaus at the time that he fired.
That can expend 7 to 8 rounds in 2 seconds?
According to studies that have been done by Dr. Lewinsky. Correct. Yeah.
You said that you're not the person who decides what happens to Gelhaus, that goes from your decision to someone else who says whether he's retired or he never gets to have his weapon for the rest of his life, or whether he goes back on duty. Is that correct? And if it's not you, then where does it go from here?
Deputy Gelhaus is employed by the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department, and any decision with regard to personnel in that department, that decision lies with the sheriff. My sole responsibility, as I've said time and again, is to determine whether or not a criminal act occurred. Not to determine what, if anything, should occur to the deputy, depending upon what determination that I make.
So we wait for the Sheriff's Department from here to find out what happens with Gelhaus?
I've given you all the information that I can in regard to your question. Thanks. Okay, anybody else who hasn't asked a question? Okay, one more?
You mentioned that the investigator and the attorney assigned to your investigation were from an outside agency?
No, they weren't from an outside agency. They're both employees of my office, but a number of the investigators in my office have come from agencies in Sonoma County. This individual has not, so doesn't have the long-term ties that some of the investigators in my office do, which I thought was important, in addition to his vast experience as an investigator. The same is true with the deputy district attorney who was assigned. That person has not had many, many years of ties with the law enforcement community, such as somebody like myself who has been here for the better part of 24 years. Yeah, so that was the only point of clarification that I wanted to make. So, okay.
Are the names of the investigator and deputy district attorney available in the report that you're providing?
No, they're not, and they are fine with me releasing their names, but honestly, ultimately, this is a decision that I made. and I made it based upon the information and the advice that they provided to me, so that I think that if anybody has any specific questions about the content of the report or the decision that was made, those questions should be directed to me. And I can certainly seek their assistance in answering those questions to the best of my ability, so I ask that that occur. So, okay, one more.
Jill, what would you say to members of the public who read your decision but don't feel satisfied with it, or that that's all that there is to say on the subject? I imagine there are already people who have heard your decision and are extremely upset by it. What do you say to them?
Well, what I can say is that this is a painful, painful chapter in the history of Sonoma County. And I think that people need to understand that I had to set aside that emotional pain and look at this case from a professional viewpoint, and that's what I endeavored to do. I think that, I hope that when people read and see how extensive our investigation and analysis has gone, they will perhaps come to a place where I came with my conclusion, which is that while this was absolutely a tragedy, it was not a criminal act. And as I indicated earlier, I will make myself available to members of the public to talk with them. I have been out in the public quite a bit since this incident occurred to explain the process that we used to reach this decision. And my hope is that while people may not agree with my decision, that they will come to understand the basis for it, and that we can have meaningful dialogue in that respect. And what I encourage the community to do going forward is to use this as a tool to improve not only community relations, but how we interface with members of our law enforcement community. Because it's imperative that we come together as a community so that we're a healthier, happier community going forward. And I would love to be part of that process. So that would be what I would say to those people. So I think I'm going to wrap it up now, and thank you all very much for coming. The report is right behind you. It's going to be posted up on the DA website, and will be available to answer questions for you as days come forward. Thank you very much.